Here then, as the first picking in all of the different materials, we're going to start with the standard material. This material provides for a couple of different uses here in LightWave. First of all is the fact that it's an analogue to the standard material that has existed in previous versions of LightWave. Therefore, for many objects that you might already have surfaced from previous versions, this acts as a placeholder for when you load them in to get their surfaces in and begun. Now, of course, previous versions of LightWave didn't require sort of the adherence to the PBR rules that the newer version of 2017 does. And so you may find that loading new objects give you results that are a bit hit or miss. Some might come in looking really good, others might not. It really does depend how you've set up those surfaces for lighting in previous versions. But going through this here will help to give you an idea of some of the adjustments that you might need to make for those where the conversion isn't so successful. Also, it'll show us how we can start using this material to set things up from scratch. And even though we do have all of the other materials that do really nice PBR stuff, there is still a place for the standard material. And this is its second function, its second place here in 2017, is the fact that it is an unconstrained material. It's very liberal. You can use it for representing a wide range of different types of materials, from plastics to metals and wood and so on. The other thing with it is that it doesn't have any built-in constraints to PBR, so you can get away with violating the PBR rules in the material if you so desire. I also think it's a pretty good material to use when you're using the cell integrator in order to do 2D cell shaded style rendering. So let's see what stuff it's got going on. Well, first of all, it's got the basic diffuse parameter for, turning the brightness of the diffuse component up or down, essentially just making the material color darker or brighter, as we, discussed when we were talking about diffuse. The diffuse setting, like all of the settings in this material, can be overamped, so you can actually push it beyond 100%. Of course, this is violating the whole energy conservation and physical shading, but it's entirely possible. We've got other stuff like luminosity, if you want it to, light up and emit light, that's available. Specular and reflection, of course, this comes back to what we were talking about with the whole specular reflection deal. Reflection in this material is a pure mirror reflection, so let's just set that at 100%, and you see that we get a pure mirror reflection here. It's completely sharp, there's no kind of, blur control for it. It's either reflective or it's not, and of course, that can be overamped if you're really wanting to for some unknown reason. You might have cause to use reflection if you just want materials that have a simple, sharp, fully glossy reflection to them. Otherwise, most of the time for doing reflection, you will want to use the specular here, and of course the glossiness is the inverse of roughness that you will see in other materials, so gloss of 0 is a fully rough material, a fully blurred reflection, and of course as you go up to 100% then you get a full mirror reflection like this. The gloss can be overamped past 100%, but when you do so it has no further effect, it just sort of clamps at 100 and that's effectively its maximum. Again, notice violation of energy conservation here because I have 100% diffuse and 100% specular. This material does leave it up to you to make it photorealistic if you're wanting to use it in a proper photorealistic way. So in this case, for 100% specular, I'd need to turn my diffuse clearly down to 0. We have, of course, transparency for making glass-like materials, so we can make, our mesh transparent here, and of course we have a refraction index to determine how refractive it is or isn't. As you can see, if you go for transparency 100% and a refraction index of 1, then it essentially disappears, it just becomes flat and plainly transparent. Though you can see these black lines that are marking out sort of the outline of certain parts, like her nose along here and of course her jaw and hair around there. This is simply where the refraction calculation is taking place, but it's stopping. And this is a function of our recursion limits here. So you see if I take the refraction recursion and I turn that up to something like 16 there, then those bits start to disappear ever more and more. But if you've got some strange object that you need to make, vanish, it's having some other effect somewhere in your scene on, something behind it perhaps, then you can do that with refraction index of 1, transparency of 100%, and of course sufficient recursions to make it completely see-through. We can also blur refractions via the refraction blur here, so you turn that up and your refractions get nice and blurry, and so you can do frosted glass style effects, as we see here, which are really quite pleasing. That sort of refraction blurring does give us some really nice little effects there. In addition to the regular transparency stuff, we also have this parameter, translucency, which allows light to pass through the model. In earlier, and I do mean much earlier versions of LightWave, this was a way of faking subsurface scattering long before we had real SSS. In this case it's working out okay. It isn't, however, just coming through, it's also adding to our lit side. We'll see that if we turn it up a lot. It's kind of like it's bumping up our diffuse. Ideally, this parameter is best avoided on meshes of this type. It's usually much better used on thin things. And when I say thin, I do mean infinitely thin, such as a single polygon, such as you might want to use if you were going to model a lampshade or something like that, and have a light inside it which was clearly lighting it up from within, but you didn't want to waste the time to have a full subsurface scattering render. We then last of all have these three options down here. Let's look at the last one first, which is diffuse sharpness. This basically lets us define the sharpness at which the diffuse picks up shadows. So if we turn that up to 100%, then you see that we get these very sharp details in the diffuse. The transition between light and dark is much starker. Not often that you'd want to use this parameter for a great many materials, but you can see it does give it a certain look, almost towards the cell shade. You might want to use this to do something of a pseudo cell shade in 3D, or again, use it with the cell integrator. For this colour highlight and colour filter, let's first of all just take her from this grey and give her a bit of a colour, so a nice pink there. If we turn the transparency back up here, let's go up to 80, shall we? Then you can see that her refractions are tinting the blacks with the colour that we have set there. But if we turn up the colour filter, then we also start to tint the whites, or the lighter rays that are coming through her. This is essentially much like absorption. You mix that in with the refraction blur here, and as you can see, you start to get these really nice frosted coloured glass sort of basic looks like this. Colour highlight does basically the same thing for highlights, for reflections. Works for both specular and reflection, so let's just do it with reflection for ease, shall we? We'll turn that up to 100%, and let's just set her diffuse to 0, because at the minute she still appears pink, as she still has diffuse value there. You'll see that as we turn up colour highlight, then her highlights become tinted with the surface colour, which gives us this metallic look. The other thing that this material has that the others lack is the good old-fashioned T buttons here for adding textures to the different parameters. So when you click those, that just brings up a layer style editor, and you can use, images or procedurals as you like in that fashion to texture the value of any of these parameters, such as, for instance, there the color, or we could perhaps use something like a checkerboard here in the reflection to give us these square sections of reflectance and non-reflectance and so on. Of course, like all the other materials, the node editor is still available for it, so you can plug in nodally here to all of the different parameters. And generally, when setting up new surfaces using this material, that's probably the preferred way to go. The texture inputs here are really just there for a bit of backwards compatibility. Either such as when you're loading pre-existing assets from earlier versions of LightWave, which have, of course, texture button setups for their parameters, or indeed for your own usage as you're getting used to this render engine and the nodes. If you've not, of course, gotten used to using nodes for surfacing in previous versions of LightWave. and you are still very much a texture layer sort of person, then having these available here gives you something that allows you to get started straight away whilst you are gradually getting used to using the nodal interface. Aside from all that, when it comes down to using this material to set up your surfaces, it really is just a case of observing what all of the different parameters do, as we've been through, and just monkeying around with them until you get a surface that replicates the sort of look that you're after. Now, the ramifications of this are twofold. On the one hand, it makes it reasonably easy to monkey around and get the sort of surface look that you want. The different parameters aren't clamped, they're not interdependent, and so you can just fudge them until you get where you're trying to go. The downside to that, of course, is the fact that it is not PBR constrained, and as such, if you are just setting these parameters without any real care or attention, whilst you might get a surface that looks good in one scene or one particular lighting setup, it might not work so well in another lighting setup. And of course, if you have that surface in a scene with other objects that are using some of the PBR materials, then they may not sit very well or pleasingly in the scene next to one another. And you find yourself back in that situation of having to make specific material adjustments for specific scenes, which is a bit of a workflow killer overall. As such, even though this material does allow you to be liberal with your treatment of the parameters, I do strongly recommend that you try and follow the basic energy conservation rules. That means keeping your diffuse, your specular and transparency balanced out so as you are around 100%. So perhaps something like a diffuse of 20%, a transparency of perhaps 60%, and then a specular or reflection of perhaps another 20%. Or of course, if you're wanting a mix of, softer reflection highlights and sharp ones, we might have 10% specular with something like 50% glossiness and then 10% reflection, to give ourselves something of a layered reflectance that contains both sharp details and a bit of spread. But 20 plus 10 plus 10 plus 60, that's a nice even 100. And as you can see, that's already giving us something fairly believable there. Since we've got some blurring in the specular, we should probably have some blurring as well in the refraction, because that blurring really is, a property of material roughness. So let's give that something like 25%, shall we? Because we've gone halfway between a, soft specular and a sharp specular. And for good measure, let's throw in a bit of colour highlight and colour filtration. And there we go, we get this sort of, really interesting looking surface. It certainly renders very nicely, it's very pretty. I'm not exactly sure what it is, it's not really glass, perhaps some sort of moulded, transparent, translucent plastic, some sort of resin. But it's certainly interesting and it is well behaved. So there we go, that really, covers all of the basics of this material and how to use it. But before we wrap up, let's go through it and have a look at how we might actually set up something that is a true PBR material from it. Go a little bit beyond just the energy conservation of making sure the values balance out here, and add into it some of the features that realistic materials have, as well as build in a couple of controls to manage the energy conservation as we go. And we'll do all of this in the nodes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a compound here. Now I'm just going to cut my standard material node and I'm going to paste it in here. Reason being because I'll wind up just using this compound as though it were a material itself. I'll call this PBR standard there. I'll just hook that into our material. So there we go, we've got that for starters. Now we're going to want a couple of things here. We're going to want, of course, a colour input. Let's just make that a blue for now, shall we? And of course our colour will connect up to our colour here. Of course we won't get a list that we can edit here in the main surface editor. We'll have to do any textures or enter any values here in the nodes via these little constants. But it'll be okay. We'll have a lovely realistic material that we can use with great ease anyway. So the next thing, we've got luminosity here. Now luminosity, that's really not bothered by any of the other material properties, right? We don't really need to worry about energy conservation for luminosity. Since it is of course an extra value, you know, the material can still have diffuse and specular and whatever else and still be emitting light. Luminosity is, you know, an added energy coming from within, light energy coming from within. So we'll leave that just set to 0 initially. Let me just name our little node there as well. Next, diffuse. Now I want to make this a, you know, automated material, so as, you know, the energy conservation is maintained for us. So I'm not actually going to feed a diffuse input into here, rather I'm going to let it be figured out by other things. So next then we're going to go for specular. We're also going to want a glossiness. Now we can keep this as glossiness, or we could perhaps change it to roughness. Many of the other materials of course use roughness, and I think that that's what I'll do here. I'll just sort of, you know, twist this over. So we'll have that there. Now reflection I'm going to deal with in the whole specular thing, and we'll see that. Transparency and refraction index will be after. Just call the refraction index IOR there. Translucency, again, you know, that's sort of a little fudge parameter, so we're going to leave that one out. Refraction blur, well, we can drive that off of our roughness, because really the roughness of the specular and the refraction should be linked. Colour highlight and colour filter, I'll want a control for these. We'll partly automate them, but we'll treat them together. We'll say that, of course, if something is transparent and it's tinting the colour, then its specular should also tint the colour, and the specular might also be tinted in other circumstances. So let's just call that one tint. Diffuse sharpness, not a huge amount of use for that in many realistic materials. I'll leave that one off. You could add the input if you wanted to control it. So I'm just going to initially set all of these values to 0 so I don't get something crazy when I'm initially designing my basic material here, with the exception of the one going to the IOR, the refraction index, which I'll put at 1.5 just so we've got something a bit refractive at any point we use transparency. So with that set up, let's look at some of the basics I want to put in here. Well, one of the main things that I'm going to want to have in a realistic material is a Fresnel effect. Now if you're wanting to make a, you know, simpler, slightly faster material, then you could of course fake this with a gradient or a curve, and then you'd just be able to pop in here and of course, you know, drag your gradient to get a specific sort of Fresnel fall off. In this example I'm going to use the actual Fresnel node, so we get a true Fresnel calculation. So of course that needs a refraction index input, so I'm going to hook up the IOR to that to begin with. And what do we have as one of the main things that we're going to want Fresnel? Well, it's going to be specular. So let's get a multiply node here. We'll take our specular value, multiply it by the result of the Fresnel, and plug that straight into our specular there. So just as we can see that, let's get our specular here and give it a value, let's just say 0.5, shall we? So there we are, 50% specularity on our item here, with of course a Fresnel effect. We can perhaps take a peek at the specular indirect buffer here, and of course we can see there on the glancing angles we are getting a stronger reflection than we are on the front facing angles here. So let us start thinking about the energy conservation properties of it then, and the most obvious one should be the diffuse, which of course we're going to drive directly here. And of course specular and diffuse counteract one another. So the diffuse is going to be the inverse of the, you know, Fresnel function, but of course minus the amount of specularity. And the easy way to do that is just to get a subtract node here. We'll set A to be 1, so 100%, and we'll simply subtract whatever the specular is. So that's of course getting the Fresnel multiplied by the specular value, and we plug that into diffuse. As a consequence, if we turn specular up to say 1 there, then we're getting very strong specular on the edges without any additional diffuse. And if we take the IOR up to something really high, like 50, which is getting towards metal, then of course we get specular all over with no diffuse at all. So that's good. Take our specular just back down to half there for our continued testing. And let's see what else we want in energy conservation. Well, transparency as well. The transparency, the specular and the diffuse should add up to 100%. So let's take another subtract node here. We'll take the transparency value that we're getting and we will subtract the amount of specularity from it and plug that into transparency. Now we can come here, we can turn our transparency up, let's say something like 0.8, and we're having the transparency go down at the glancing angles where the specular is strong, and of course the transparency is stronger on the front where the specular is weaker. Let's just leave that at 0.8 for a minute, because one of the other things that we also want to happen is we want the diffuse to go down as the transparency goes up. So let's get another subtract node here. This is currently our diffuse value, so we'll take that and from it we will subtract the amount of transparency that we are using and now plug that into diffuse. So there we go, we've balanced out our diffuse to account for the specular and Fresnel. We've balanced out our transparency to account for the specular with Fresnel, and we've also secondarily balanced our diffuse to account for the amount of transparency. We haven't yet worked out the roughness, so let's do that. We'll take another subtract node here, because of course roughness is the inverse of gloss, or gloss is the inverse of roughness. So we'll take the roughness value into B, we'll make A 1, so it's 1 minus the roughness, and we'll plug that into the glossiness setting here. Since the refraction blur is unblurred at 0 and fully blurred at 1, then we can call that the same as roughness, and so we can take the roughness value straight into it. And so now when we change the roughness, let's say 0.5, then we are getting both refractive and specular reflective blurring in concert with one another. Of course, at 0 we're getting no blurring at all, and here's where I want to throw in a little cheat. Of course, we've got the reflection parameter that gives us just, pure mirror-like reflections, and that doesn't need to be sampled, unlike specular. As such, it renders a bit quicker. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a logic node, I'm going to take the roughness and plug that into A. I'm going to make the B value here be 0, and I'm going to ask, is A greater than B? So is my roughness above 0 by any amount? Is there even the tiniest amount of roughness in there? If true, so if there is any roughness at all, then I'm going to get this value here that's driving our specular, okay, and make that the true value, and the false will just be 0, and we plug this into our specular. So now when there's any roughness in the specular input just gets our calculated specular value here. I'm then going to take a copy of this logic node. We're asking exactly the same thing. Is the roughness greater than 0? This time, if true, I'm going to output 0. And if false, I'm going to get the computed value of our specular and put that to reflection. What has this done for me? Basically, what it has done is when my roughness is at 0, I don't want any blurring in my reflections, then I'm just using the pure mirror reflection part of the standard material. It doesn't need to be sampled and it renders more quickly. But when I do have any measure of roughness, no matter how small, then I get sampled specularity with, of course, however much blurring that has. So like that, you see, not only can I, fiddle around in the node editor here to give myself a automatic balance for the energy conservation of my material, I can also take advantage of this little reflection parameter that's included to give myself slightly faster rendering materials in situations where I want a fully glossy reflection. With that done, we can move on to the tint here. Now tint, of course, is also respecting the Fresnel function, but of course it goes in the opposite direction to the amount of specular or transparency. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a new multiply node. I'm going to take the amount of tint, multiply that by the inverse of the Fresnel function that we're getting, and I'm going to plug that to both color highlight and color filter there. So let's give that a go, shall we? Let's put our tint, let's just put it all the way up at 1, and let's just bring our roughness back down to 0, and we see that we've got our reflections there being tinted, as well as of course the refraction colour, the absorption colour. So that's all working out for us as well. Then the last thing that we need to do, of course, is hook up the refraction index for transparency, for which we can use the exact same IOR value here. And there we go. We've set ourselves up a nice physically based material using the standard node, and we can just use this compound in its place and either have constants like this to just type in direct values, or of course we can hook in textures or whatever else to drive all of these guys. And we can play around with the values like this, try and get ourselves some interesting looking materials, whilst having the whole thing properly respect the normal PBR workflow, and thus fitting in with all of our lighting and other materials that we might use. So there we have it. That is the standard material, its various settings and tweaks and creative ways in which we can muddle around to bring it into the PBR workflow and get great results from it, in order to create a variety of looks and material types.